there's a lot of British interest in Sweden, but then I have to remind you that Swedes have somewhat of a permanent interest in the UK. And it's not only about the Prime Minister's Question Time, Midsummer Murders and Downtown Abbey and Premier League, but most things. And I realize that when you hear about Sweden, many of you associate us with ABBA, IKEA and Borg. But nowadays it's not Björn Borg anymore, but our Minister of Finance, Anders Borg, that people associate us with. Then, of course, Stig Larsson, as well as the Wallander series. Some might have watched The Bridge, or might have read the hilarious book The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared. And the latter has done wonders to promote the image of a more optimistic go-getter mentality rather than the more depressed middle-aged Swedish man. In fact, entrepreneurship and opportunity is currently where we rank the highest in the most recent Legatum Prosperity Index. Sweden is the home of several large companies in many different areas, and we have a strong tradition of inventors and entrepreneurs with ideas that have made quite an impact around the world. Recent Swedish innovations such as Skype and Spotify are well known around the world. Around 90% of Swedes have access to internet, and 50% of our population are on Facebook. The willingness to adapt to new technologies has significantly contributed to increased productivity and growth. And the Swedish model has often been portrayed as a chief example of a universal welfare state, but a new image of Sweden is quickly gaining ground. Sweden is not only a welfare state, but a thriving market economy where inequality is low. To strive for a successful model that will not only give better value for taxpayers' money, but that also better corresponds to people's needs. Affordable daycare is one example. A typical Swedish family is made up of adults who work and are not financially dependent on each other. The affordable daycare is a fundamental change in the Swedish society. It's a change that has basically led to the disappearance of the Swedish housewife. Another important aspect that makes people more ready to take risks and open their own businesses is that they are protected from extreme risk by a universal safety net. Greater cooperation and benchmarking between countries like Sweden and the UK is truly beneficial to citizens, and I think that we all need to be able to navigate in an increasingly competitive world. And that's why I'm so pleased about having this cooperation with Legatum Institute and today's panel with excellent speakers. Thank you.
Madam Ambassador, thank you very much. I'm Jeff Gedman. I'm President and CEO of the Legatum Institute. I want to thank the Ambassador for that terrific introductory remark, and also for the cooperation. This is a fantastic collaboration between us and the Swedish Embassy. We have a distinguished audience today. We are live streaming, so anybody who's joining us but not physically present, welcome to all of you. I want to thank my colleague Hal Williams, who's a guiding spirit behind this collaboration. Hal, welcome and good that you're here today. And our panel. Before I introduce the panel, I just want to note that indeed, as the Ambassador said, in our annual Prosperity Index, the publication that we put out here at the Legatum Institute, a global survey of 140-some countries around the world, inquiry, as we call it, into wealth and well-being, the Scandinavian countries, and indeed Sweden, rank very, very well, always in these last years, the top 5. And so the panel today is called, Is the Swedish Model Here to Stay? And it's a curious question. It's a good question, but when I hear this question asked, I hear at least 3 different things. One I hear is, you bet it's here to stay. It's the triumph and great example of social democracy. And then I hear another group say to me, well, you bet it's here to stay. Those Swedes sure know how to reform. And they went from bloated welfare states in the 1990s to something more flexible and agile and competitive because they privatized and deregulated sensibly and so forth. And then I have another group saying to me, well, I don't know if it's here to stay or not, but what model? Because didn't you notice that these tend to be small countries and size matters, and Norway has oil and Denmark and Sweden are different in this or that way. So don't go thinking that Great Britain or the United States or Mexico could emulate these particular cases because they are so distinct. Our panel will answer those questions and more in just a moment. First, if I may introduce this distinguished group from my left to right, Graham Leach, who is a longtime friend of the Legatum Institute. He is a distinguished economist, a very gifted researcher and prolific writer, and wrote about this for us just 2 years ago on what makes the Scandinavian countries tick, strengths, weaknesses, comparative thoughts, and so forth. Graham is chief economist at the Institute of Directors here in London, and please join me in welcoming Graham Leach. Next to Graham, is Klaus Eklund, senior economist, the Scandinavian and Skilda Bank. He's an adjunct professor at Lund University. He has worked in the Prime Minister's office. He's worked at the Swedish Ministry of Finance and has both strong academic and analytical skills, but also terrific governmental and political experience. Welcome to you, Klaus. Glad you're here with us. And then finally, to my immediate left, Henrik Berggren, who is a historian, an author, a former political editor of an important newspaper in Sweden, and brings not only strong analytical skills, but even, I think, deeper contact with political trends, political sense and sensibilities, and I think he rounds out this panel beautifully. Welcome. So if I may, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to pick on you first, Graham. You have written a paper about this so-called model, and you will give it greater detail and justice than I do in my simple question. But you have argued that in part, Sweden and its neighbors, but let's talk about Sweden for a moment, has profited a great deal in the last years and decade through sensible reform. Could you lay out that argument a little bit, and then we'll tease that out in the ensuing discussion?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the traditional argument from the left has been that the Nordic model, Swedish model, makes the case for big government because it's not incompatible with stronger growth. Now, that's an argument that the rights had some trouble refuting, which is why we embarked on the Legatum report. And I think the key thing there is that, yes, the size of the state in these economies and in Sweden is still very large, but you have seen a massive shrinkage in the size of the state over recent decades as well. In the case of Sweden, the state's fallen from 70% to 50% of GDP, roughly. That will have a positive effect on growth. If you look at the standard economic models and the research there over recent decades, then that is going to have a substantial impact between maybe 1% and 2% in terms of the percentage points of addition to growth. Now, that doesn't mean that all the success story in recent years and decades has been attributable to the shrinkage in the size of the state. But it does mean that there are market reforms and market-led activities which have helped, and supporting that as well. The Scandinavian economies score well in Legatum, in other global competitive indices for freedom of trade, for openness, and indeed for institutional aspects as well in terms of degree of regulation in product markets as well. So a combination of influences, no simple transfer or simple model or explanation, but I think that combination of market shift and relatively small but open economies means that they've actually yielded quite a return from a pro-market shift. But that doesn't mean that you can now say, they've shrunk 20 percentage points. That means that actually 50% of GDP is still an acceptable size for the state. No, we could not. We're not far from that figure, and it causes all sorts of problems. So I think they get away with a higher figure because of the openness and the relatively small homogeneous economies, which you couldn't get away with over here.
Okay. Is this an argument, you brought up, what troubles the right, or, this left-right argument or dichotomy. is the success in recent years of what Sweden has done the argument, look, you conservatives, this is how social democracy can work. It's a welfare state, but it's relatively lean and agile and competitive.
I think it is very difficult for large economies to draw lessons in that area from very small open economies. I think you can draw the obvious one that the shrinkage in the size of the state and the degree of openness in economic activity has helped sustain growth. But if you hadn't had those shifts over recent decades, then I think the Swedish or the Nordic model would look in desperate straits now.
Okay, thank you. Klaus, could I call on you and if I could break this into two parts, could you may agree or disagree with Graham's assessment. First, tell us what, in your view, has happened the last decade in Sweden, just descriptively, and then give us a little bit of interpretation of what it means.
Then I have to go back 2 decades, actually, because Graham talks about the change and the sort of downsizing of government. He's partly correct, but that took place in the 90s. We had our great financial crisis in the early 90s, and that sort of forced us to wake up. Suddenly the Swedes realized that we were not God's own chosen people. Even we had to change. And that took place through a number of different policy areas. New pension system, membership with the European Union, new budget rules, fiscal austerity, competitive reforms in utilities, infrastructure, a number of things, all squeezed together in just a couple of years. So that was a truly important policy shift, which also shows, since it was successful after a while, that sometimes comprehensive reform is better than piecemeal if you really stand with your back against the wall, like many countries in Europe are doing today. But the reason it succeeded is also partly because we were helped from abroad. We could let the currency fall, which many countries in Europe cannot do today. And this happened in a benign international environment, which is not the case today. So we were helped by a number of things. So you're right in saying there were many reforms, but that sort of leads me to the second question then. Why could not only Sweden but also Finland and before us Denmark and Norway go through some of these changes almost at the same time? And then I think that some of the specification of the model or the Nordic experience make it somewhat easier for us. You mentioned the fact that we're small open economies, but also the tradition of consensus decision-making, where the domestic differences in politics were not that sharp or divisive as they are in many other countries, but also the way that the public sector per se was and is still shaped. Universalism means, sure, the welfare state is expensive, but almost everybody gets something from it. So everybody has a stake in reforming it and seeing that it works. And Henrik knows much more about this than I, and he's written more profusely about it. But this also creates this degree of trust, which means that if the Nordic politicians go out and say, we have to go through this period of austerity, then people may grit their teeth and they might not like it, but they still trust the politicians. If they say it's necessary, we might have to do it, which is, of course, not the case in a country like Greece, where the main national sport is sort of cheating the Internal Revenue Service. So the way the public sector and our history was set up also made it possible to downsize and streamline the public sector. So it is a reform, yes, but it's in a certain respect a reform within the boundaries of the old model as well. So it's a rejuvenation, a renewal, but it's still sort of something particularly Scandinavian that's happening.
On that, in that respect, are there other cultural attributes or values that play a role? You know, in my own country, I come from the United States, we may have had these values at one time, but I fear in recent years we've lost our way a little bit in the area of savings and thrift and patience and deferred gratification. That's not the world of hard economics, but it's an underlying foundation of values which I think can either help or hinder economic development. Does that play a role in Sweden?
I guess this is your sort of show. You'll pick on this later. But yes and no. I mean, if you look at the hard economic numbers, Sweden in the early 90s was in real poor shape, as was Finland, partly because of what's happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. And Denmark was the sick man of Europe in the 70s to a large extent. But what happened was, in the case of Sweden, that our savings ratio did pick up. Our international trade balance did improve. The budget did improve. But they improved because of hard political measures and changes. People reacted to economic incentives. Taxes were lowered, income taxes, but also the possibility to deduct for interest payments was lowered sharply. So while the normal Swedish citizen was sort of paid to dis-save pre-1991-93, after that they were paid to save. And since economic incentives are important, that actually did change the behavior of the Swedish households and the Swedish companies and the Swedish government. I was chair of a government commission on the efficiency of the public sector in those days, and we compared the Swedish budget system to other countries in Europe. And at the press conference I said, we in this respect, when it comes to the budget rules, we are a spaghetti economy. We are as bad as Italy, which caused a friend of mine who's an Italian economist to call me in rage and saying, "You're much worse than we." But then there were reforms, and now we have this surplus target, we have a 3-year rolling sort of budget process, we have an expenditure ceiling, and the result is that the budget is in much, much better shape, not only in numbers, but in the way we do our budget. But that's hard, tough decisions. But these decisions were taken in times of crisis. I think, unfortunately, the combination of a crisis and sort of the consensus views and all that made it possible to change. But if it hadn't been for the crisis, I don't think we would have reformed the old model, because we were a bit complacent, and like I said, we were so happy and we were turning into fat cats. But when the crisis hit, and it hit real hard in the early 90s, then we were forced to change, and we actually did succeed in changing.
Good, thank you. Henrik, let's get you in. And could you talk to us a little bit about culture and values, and to what extent those things play a role?
Well, I mean, definitely. I'm not so good at economy, and I'm not so keen on models either. You know, it's like I have bad memories from boyhood when you bought these airplane models. And, you know, you get glue all over your fingers and you couldn't read.
And they don't always fly.
No, and they look nothing like the glossy pictures on the outside. Well, I think, you're asking this question of whether this model will live on, and when it comes to economy, I think that in a couple of years, the story might be totally different. We can't really predict that at all. I do think, though, that there is a sort of Nordic historical experience that can be brought to the table in talking about the process of modernity and democratization in the whole world. I think the discussion is shifting a bit. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon, the American, the British experience has been so dominant when you think about these things, and I think it's changing in the sense that we're seeing, that countries arrive modernized in very different ways, and we have this, authoritarian capitalism of China and Russia, and we have perhaps, hopefully, some kind of Islamic modernization, and we have the continental European Christian democratic way. I think one could bring the Nordic countries to the table, sort of saying, look, there's some things to be learned here. There's some things we could bring out here. And I would emphasize in cultural values, I think we would, I would say that a sort of egalitarian idea, and this goes both in terms of class, but not least these days, in terms of gender, basically. There's a strong idea of sort of an autonomous citizen who is not dependent on others, who can shift for himself, and he can do this because the state will back him up, will make him or her less dependent on families, employers, organizations, and things like that. And I think the prime example here is the whole gender equality family policy bit, which has deep roots historically. And when you look at it around today in Europe, you see that we're in a situation where the average European says they want 2.3 children. And I mean, this is what people say when you survey them. They want to have that many children. But in very many countries, people are not having that amount of children. And I think that's because it's very difficult for families to both have family life and have children, and also both partners working. And in that sense, I think that there's something interesting from the Nordic countries in that we have created a system where you sort of create gender equality by parental leave, by taking away joint taxation, by sort of separating the family members and making the family into this sort of voluntary union rather than this legally sort of binding and perhaps patriarchal institution.
And subsidized childcare.
And exactly, childcare essentially, exactly. And I think that's in Germany now. There's a huge discussion about that because they have a very low fertility rate. In Southern Europe, there's a very low fertility rate, and they're sort of wondering why aren't women having children? It's because they have to make a choice between work and family. And in that sense, I think there's something to be brought to the table here that this is something that is necessary because the capitalism. I mean, what did Marx say? I mean, capitalism does away with the old the motley feudal ties, right? Well, I mean, capitalism does break down family values too. I mean, it creates individuals who are market-oriented, and if you're going to have functioning families, I think the state needs to come in and provide these kind of things, and that I think is something that you can take from the Nordic countries.
Well, thank you for that. But Graham, I can't imagine that you, as a robust free market economist, appreciates what Henrik just said, that capitalism breaks down families and the state has to intervene to prop them up. I mean, my words, not yours.
This is slightly wider than the original brief, I think. But I would counter it with a UK example. We've got the most expensive childcare in Europe. And most of that is directly attributable to the government intervention in the market. So a market-led childcare system in the UK would probably deliver cheaper childcare. But I'm not an expert on childcare, so I'm probably out of area at the moment here. But could I just come back on one thing? I mean, when we're talking about the size of the state, we have to be clear as well that although an econometric model may give you some trade-offs in terms of the impact, it is complicated and it does depend on whether or not that expenditure which makes up the state's activity is more productive or less productive. Is it infrastructure? Is it more consumption spending? So productive or unproductive expenditure determines the negative impact of the size of the state, and also whether the taxation system is distortionary or non-distortionary as well. And so it is a complicated picture, but the key thing here is that it's very difficult to transfer from lessons from small open economies to us, because just to finish that point really, Sweden in the early 90s responded to the crises fairly effectively as well, because it was a more homogenous populace and the political divide wasn't as wide, let's say. UK economy 15 years later, faced with a similar depth of financial crisis, does not manage to impose the same level of fiscal reform. And so we can learn from them just as they can learn from us.
Klaus.
You're right in saying that the public expenditure in Sweden fell sharply from 1991 and onwards. But I think when you pick that starting point, you sort of overstate the case a bit, because at that time, because of the deep crisis, the expenditure was sort of temporarily blown up. But the public sector has shrunk as share of GDP, but not quite as much as you say.
Hey, I'd take 15 points of GDP any day.
But I think the main point that's interesting about the Scandinavian countries' public sector is not the size per se. It's what's debated in this recent issue of The Economist, where they claim, and I agree, that perhaps the interesting thing is not the size per se, but the fact that the public sector is quite efficient compared to many other countries. It's not corrupt, it's not clientelism, and it's, like I said, universalist, in the sense that most people, just about everybody, has a stake in it. Meaning that it's not like in the US, your own country, where people say, oh, I see, these guys are on welfare. I know who are the recipients of sort of the public expenditure. That's not the case in Scandinavian countries. Everybody's, in a sense, involved. And that creates this kind of universalism. And what I think you could make your point even stronger. It's not only about gender equality, which is important per se, but it's the fact that the welfare state, the way it is built in our countries, also makes it possible for individuals to become freer as individuals in many different respects. Women are liberated from their husbands, sure. Children are liberated from their parents to a certain extent. And we can become individuals because there is a very strong safety net. We are protected by the government, not at exorbitant tax rates anymore, but still high tax rates. So this creates sort of a fundamental secure basis from where we can grow as individuals, which makes, if you look at us, we are not Soviet-type communists. We're not gray, drab, clad and clothed and believe in Lenin or something like that, even though we have big states. On the contrary, many of our countries are very modern. We are creative. We are designers. We create music and art and whatever. And this, I think, is partly because of this smarter way that the welfare state works in the Nordic countries. It's not only welfare for the poor that you can see. Everybody has a stake. Everybody, to a certain extent, becomes a bit more secure, and that liberates us as individuals. And that is something that the Anglo-Saxon sort of critique of the state in the Nordic countries never really has understood. The combination of the strong state and strong individuals. Now there are plenty of problems. I assume we'll come to them soon. But in this particular respect, I think there is something that is good to be said about the Nordic welfare state, the way it works.
Well, let me ask Graham and then ask you two gentlemen to respond, but I'm going to start with him because he's written about this, I think, from a little bit of a different perspective.
Sure.
In my shorthand, Graham, isn't it your argument that social democracy in Sweden is working well now because, in essence, it's become less social democratic, actually?
I'm not sure it's that. You can have a social democratic state at various levels, but I would agree with your point about the more efficient state, and that goes back just to the relative size of the economy. I don't think you could necessarily transpose. You can't upsize the Swedish economy to 3 times as big and say the model would work in the same way at that scale. And I think that's the key point, that we're back towards the debate between productive and unproductive spending. There are elements of the Swedish model which create greater efficiency, which lead to, let's say, slightly more productive levels of expenditure than compared with that level of expenditure in the UK. But that is not an argument to say that model will then work outside the Nordic regions. It's a scale, it's a size thing.
But not only, look at the Danish labour market, the flexicurity system. It gives you, as a member of the labour market or participating on the labour market, it gives you a certain sort of basic security because you are encompassed by the system of protection. But you have to be at the disposal of the labour market, and you have to go through vocational training, you have to seek new jobs. So it's a system which gives you this kind of basic security, but at the same time creates or allows flexibility and vocational training and all that stuff. It's one example of a smart way of organizing the public sector, I think.
I want to ask Henrik a question. You're free to say whatever you want, because you first. You wanted to
get
in on this. I don't want to cut you off.
We're getting into a very old argument here. I have a feeling, Claes could probably say more about this, but, through my life, I've heard the predictions of the downfall of the Swedish welfare state so many times that, it's always been falling down, it's going to collapse because of its weight. Now, it may not be, it may not be the supermodel at all, but the interesting thing is that it does survive, and it reinvents itself and solves the problems. And I think the basic reason it survives is because it answers to certain needs that the citizens have. It solves problems that citizens feel are necessary to be solved. And as Claes pointed out, it is this idea that people feel that they are emancipated by the welfare state. It gives them, empowers them, makes it possible for them to live their lives in a better way. And I think that's sort of fairly firmly rooted in an egalitarian tradition in the Nordic countries. That may be difficult to transpose to other places, but I think there's something you can sort of just make the argument that look, this does not lead to economic downfall, having these kinds of ideas, and that can be, and especially if you look at the families. If you look at the family situations, one problem with economists is that reproduction comes into it so little. But reproduction, I think, is so fundamental also for the well-being of a society. And when you get countries where women don't want to have babies, basically, the family life is not functioning because people feel they have to make a choice between work and work. You know, it's not an economic question, but it's a question of what kind of society do you have.
So you've ignited the red-blooded free marketer in me now, but you've actually supported my core point, which is that you could not have sustained this model had you not shrunk the size of the state. You could not have shrunk. You could not have sustained the Swedish model at 65 to 70% of GDP. You would have had the mother of all crises, and I'm not sure what the outcome of that would have been. But my argument is you may just get away with it at 50% in a way that larger economies can't, but you sure as damn it can't do it at 65 to 70%.
Well, I agree. But nobody's questioning that.
Well, I thought...
Nope.
I thought it was.
And realize that the modernization of these models, both in Finland, Sweden, Denmark and Norway, have been taking place under a period of 20 years or so by both right-wing and left-wing governments. Both right-wing and left-wing governments. I mean, there have been some differences, of course, but if you look at Sweden, the main reforms undertaken in the mid-90s were undertaken by both conservative coalition governments and SDP governments.
But also, I mean, the way things are going, I mean, I'm not sure these large economies you're talking about. I see a lot of small economies out there, and some countries are actually splitting up. So we're getting, it seems like an awful lot of small countries that could.
There's nothing wrong with small economies. We could learn a lot of lessons from them. There's nothing.
Gentlemen, let's pause. We have a distinguished group here at the Legatum Institute today, and I'm sure lots of questions and comments. I'd like to open it up to my team. Do we have a microphone that will be? We have a microphone, Chloe. Thank you very much. Who would be first, and if you would identify yourself for us, please. And if I need to, I'll call on people. Yes, please.
Hi there. My name is Jo Fidgen. I'm interested whether you think the Swedish model is something that immigrants can buy into wholesale, and if they can or can't, what difference that is going to make to the Swedish model in future.
Anybody?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, historically, this is a model then that has come out of a rather homogeneous national state. That's very clear, and it's a huge discussion in Sweden about these things now. But I would tend to take an optimistic view, though, that this idea of sort of the welfare state creating this kind of security that Claes has described is something that can work with immigrants too. I mean, obviously there are problems here. I'm not denying that, but I think that it is. It seems to me that it is a universal model. In that sense, you can bring in. It's not an issue of it's not a culturally determined model, but it has an idea of a universal values. And of course, immigration is it's a very long process. I mean, you have people coming from very different backgrounds, and of course there are confrontations between these issues. But I think it could accommodate, yes.
But there are challenges and difficulties. Unemployment is high in many Nordic, not in Norway, but in the other three Nordic countries, unemployment is high, and there's an unproportionally high unemployment rate among immigrants. And I think, at least in Sweden, this is partly because the thresholds into the labor market, the sort of secure labor market, are high, and they have risen because of increasing demands on competence and more technologically advanced positions, things like that. So many immigrants, especially if they come from faraway countries, they don't know the language, they have different cultural set background, different education, have difficulties coming into this sort of secure labor market. So there's an increasing insider-outsider problem, as the economist would put it, on the Swedish labor market. Same on the Danish, partly the same also on the Finnish, actually. So this is going to be a huge test for our system. And it's not immigration per se which is the test, but it's a threshold into the labor market, I think. That is the great problem.
Thank you. Let's take another question, please. Dominic Lawson. A microphone will come to you, Dominic. Yeah. And hang on, just for our audience who's not here today. And Dominic, if you would identify yourself, please.
Yeah, from Sunday Times and The Independent. I'm interested in the question of stigma, because you speak about how the welfare state works, and you describe it as liberating. In this country, to a large extent, it's had that, but also adverse consequences. But in if there isn't a kind of stigma, or if societies are not close enough that social stigma actually works, then people's conduct can be aberrant. And I wonder whether the success of the Swedish model within what, as you say, is quite a significantly larger welfare state than in many other countries, is because you still have quite close communities, maybe more than other countries, where people behave well. They don't exploit the system, they don't abuse the system, because there is a kind of neighborhood stigma. People know who other people are, and that keeps them on the straight and narrow. This may be a function of what you're saying is the big country, the small country, and it may be a question of homogeneity. But I wonder how much that is a reason why it works better than in some other countries.
Well, historically, it's worked better sometimes and worse sometimes, and that has partly to do with economic incentives. I mean, I'm the crass economist here. So, back in the 80s, the benefit levels were simply too high. I mean, you could have 100% pay more or less staying away from work, just claiming you were sick, which led, for instance, at the conveyor belt at Volvo, 1/3 of the people were never there. They had to overhire in order to compensate for that. It was simply too expensive. And one result of the crisis, and one way of cutting down the public expenditure, was lowering benefit levels. And that was done by social democratic government as well as right-wing government. So, and that was simply by need. But given those, and now it's working much better, but given those swings for economic needs, I think there might be something about this homogeneity and the universality of the system as well, because the stigma is less in a system where everybody can access, where you don't sort of single out the poor ones or the needy ones and say, you are on welfare, I'm not. Because the system is built on the insight that we all sometimes during our life are weak or fragile and might need the system. And therefore you shouldn't look down on the people who need it right now. And that, I don't know if that is viable in a bigger country, but I'm sure the smallness and homogeneity of the Swedish population, or Norwegian and Danish, have certainly helped in creating this universality, I think. But you know
no, I agree. And just to add on to that, I mean, the point you were making earlier, I mean, we have never really perceived our system as a sort of dole system. I mean, the whole point of the welfare system is not means tested. It's not direct economic aid to people in difficult situations. But the whole idea of welfare is actually, say the student loan system or something like that, which is not means tested and means that everybody gets the same student loans. It's parental leave. It's unemployment insurance, which means that you can actually be more flexible on the labor market. So that's sort of where the sort of idea of the welfare state, that's been sort of the ideology of it, not this idea of giving out poor relief in that sense. But obviously, yes, I mean, the problem does exist, clearly, but I mean, that's, it's all over. I mean, I don't see it's looking at the debate in Britain today about a woman who has 11 children. I mean, it seems to be a sort of, very common sort of debate in Europe these days.
Graham?
I think there's something to what you said, Dominic. Obviously, in smaller homogeneous grouping, then you can have that benefit, whereas you wouldn't get it in the UK. But look at unemployment levels as well. They're not exactly low. And so there is some consequence as well from the size of the welfare state. It's not as if there's no consequence here. You can see it in unemployment levels too, at least in part.
Good. Bonnie, if you take the microphone and introduce yourself, please.
Yep. My name is Bonnie Greer. I'm a playwright and also deputy chair of the British Museum. And so my general question is going to be about culture, but also about something that is very interesting that you've all said and sort of struck a note with me. Like Jeff, as you can hear, I was also born and raised in the United States. And what seems interesting to me that the Anglo-American model of, say, the state is that it is a thing apart from you. It is a thing that you keep out of your life as much as you possibly can. It is a thing that if it comes into your life, it comes as an intervention and something that has to be got away with as quickly as possible, and that it is in fact alien to you. Ronald Reagan said 20, 30 years ago, the worst words that you can hear are, hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And it is a very American sort of feeling. It's very much here as well in the United Kingdom to an extent as well. Whereas what I understand you're saying about Scandinavia, which is interesting to me, is that the state is us. In other words, it is not apart from us. It becomes a kind of, it is a way to level. It is a way to make everyone equal. And so, in fact, the individual has a stake in the success of the state. It has a stake in the success of its neighbor because the state is us. So do you think that with immigrant populations coming in, with the fact that the birth rate is going down, with the whole idea of this sort of Anglo-Saxon thing is actually in crisis, this idea the state is going to change itself, that it in fact has to change, that there's a big challenge in relation to it. And your success is because people have bought in to the notion of the state. And that's our struggle in America and here too. What is the state? What's it for?
You know, Bonnie, sorry, just to segue, you know, as a fellow American, oh, so true. And you know, as you were speaking, it just came to mind that, well, for one comparison, we in the United States call the government Uncle Sam. In a country like Germany, the expression may be a little bit old-fashioned, but they call it Vaterstaat. I don't know what it's called in Swedish, but the uncle and father are very different relationships with very different expectations. So at any rate, I'll just let that stand, and then Graham, and then we'll go around the panel.
I think I would challenge actually the fundamental notion that of the Anglo-American model here, certainly from the Anglo bit, as being small state. It's not small state; it's large state.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. No, and I didn't mean to imply that.
Take the microphone because we have an audience that's not physically present.
Sorry,
we have to make sure.
To just say I didn't. I'm sorry if I implied it. What I implied was the individuals. What I meant was the individual's relationship to the state.
I understand
they felt.
Yeah. But and you can. The state is, as you can see, how in a smaller economy and a smaller homogeneous grouping, that effect could operate. I understand. But I think one of the remarkable things is now, if you look at the size of the state in the UK, I know this is wider than your own point. It is quite probable that the state is larger in the UK than it is in Sweden, in actual fact, because if you look at the total public spend in the UK, but on top of that, there's all sorts of mandated expenditures on the private sector, which may actually fall within the public sector in the Nordic model. For example, you know, you may have had benefit payments to the poor before, and now you've got the national minimum wage in the UK. So public spending, by comparison, is lower than it otherwise would have been. But actually, the total intervention of the state is still the same as it was before. It's just mandated on the private sector in a way that maybe wouldn't happen in Sweden or other Nordic countries. So I think that, so when we're comparing ourselves with the Nordic model, actually, we're not comparing ourselves from down here looking up. Actually, I think we're comparing ourselves in terms of public spending, the scale of, from up there looking down.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gentlemen?
Well, first of all, to say, I mean, Sweden in particular, but the Scandinavian countries in general, have had a very happy experience with the state. I mean, we've had a long history of stability, of peace, of not being invaded. I mean, it's a long time since we were in huge wars and things like that. Obviously, these things make for a much more benign conception of the state. I mean, if you go to Germany, for instance, I mean, I can sort of see the point. I mean, why the Germans put so much emphasis on the family, because if you had a breakdown of the state 2 times during the 20th century, I mean, you really need to put emphasis on those institutions that will hold against that kind of terror from the state from above. But that said, I mean, I think, and I guess I don't agree with you, I have a different political position there, that I think the challenges that we are facing in the world today, I think we need to bring in the idea that the state can solve them. And this, a kind of programmatic suspicion of the state is not really very helpful to us. That doesn't mean that the state is good. It doesn't mean the state is bad. It's just sort of, the state is there. And I think people get very excited about the state, but I see it as sort of a fact of life. And the question is, how do you manage the state? How do you get the most out of it for the benefit of the citizens? And, corruption, everything, efficiency.
I mean, the histories of our different countries are really different. I mean, the US was founded in a revolution against a king, against taxation. That was the frontier. You could move west, etc., etc. The small Nordic countries have been homogeneous for hundreds of years. We have had a strong state, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, in Sweden, from Axel Oxenstierna in the early 17th century, has been very strong, very centralized. Sometimes oppressive during the wars, sometimes liberating, like in the sort of the modern way that state works. But it's there. I agree with you. It's there. It's a fact of life. And sometimes when we have been in bad times and when taxes have gone up too far, sure, many people have said, oh, the tax man is too strong. But then taxes have fallen. But the state is always there anyway. And it's very difficult to see any of our Nordic countries sort of work the way the US is doing, because the histories are completely different, completely.
I'm oversimplifying here, but there is surely an argument to be made that in the early post-war period, the size of the state in the Nordic economies was relatively small. They were faster growing then. Then the state exploded and these economies slowed sharply. In the wake of the shrinkage in the state, growth has accelerated again in these economies. I don't think the two aren't unrelated.
Well, let me ask you this question. Henrik, you said at the top of the program, and I rather liked it, you said, I don't really like models. We're talking about models. And neither do I. And yet, it's one way that many of us think. You know, we want to compare, and we want to say, you know, what is Sweden doing vis-a-vis Britain or the United States, the Czech Republic, what have you, either in terms of, you know, contemporary comparison or historically. That's what the Chileans did, or that's what the Poles did. So, you know, having accepted the fact that history matters and culture matters and size matters, and I'll ask the other two gentlemen the same question. Since we are talking about Sweden today and success, right, you know, the last 20 years, reform and success, if a small to medium-sized country came to you today and said, give me some insight into your lessons learned over the last 2 decades, the kind of wisdom you have now about what Sweden has done right and what Sweden has done wrong, what would be the top-line lessons that you would share? Again, it would depend on, you know, whether that country is in Central Europe or Africa. I know that, but leave that aside for a second. Just top-line observations, lessons learned.
Well, the last 2 decades, I think maybe Klaus is better. I mean, I would take a longer perspective. I mean,
Please.
in doing this and saying that you know, given these you know, historical contingencies, these, you know, rather benign conditions, but what you have is you know, a rather successful way of creating a society. Obviously, it's got drawbacks. I mean, we were talking about the state before. We should remember that the tradition of natural rights is very weak in Sweden. And we've had, I mean, for instance, the forced sterilization issues and things like that. So this trust in the state, of course, also can make you very you know, weak in terms of when you need to claim your individual rights. You know, there's really no tradition there because you have this very benign notion of the state. So, I mean, you know, I would put also experiences of that kind into the. But that said, I think that it is a question of what I said previously, that how you can use the state to solve problems if you don't have a sort of very programmatic idea of you know, what the state is, if it, you know, it's bad or anything like that. And in the sense that I do think there's a direction in history, to be honest with you. I do think, like Alexis de Tocqueville said, that, you know, we're moving in the direction of I can't even say this, I'm sorry, individualization, of more and more people experience themselves as autonomous individuals separated from their communities, from other people around them. And this is a process that's going around the whole world, and everybody sees themselves as much more as a person whose you know, dreams and life counts as much as the next person. This is a very destabilizing process. I mean, we see it in the Arab Spring. These things are going on. But it's also, I think it is, you know, I hate determinism, but I think this is a force in history. And the question is, how do we deal with all this individualism? How do we see to it that all these individuals do get, you know, the possibility to realize themselves? And I don't think the market can provide the only answer. I think the state has to be there too, and there has to be a negotiation between what is the state and what is the market. Now, if you want to talk about negative experiences these last 2 decades, I think there's a problem that in general in the Western world we have moved from having a market economy to being market economies. That is, we have moved the market inside our minds, and we have, I mean, a problem in Sweden, I think, is, and you know, we're very susceptible to new public management, and this efficiency that I agree with you has definitely done wonders for Sweden in many ways, but it's also created a lot of pseudo markets within the public sector where you have we're measuring and counting things within the health system and things like that. It's very unclear that this is actually, you know, creating quality in education or health services. So, yeah.
I would draw the completely opposite conclusion. I would say that we've become completely statist in our minds in a Western sense. We've not become completely market, we've become completely statist. Now we pass by on the other side. We're no longer the good Samaritan, it's somebody else's responsibility. That's the real problem of individualization in a Western sense.
Klaus?
If you ask me about important lessons learned, I will have to give you the contrary, unsexy, and very crass economist answer, and that is budgetary discipline. I mean, Sweden, Finland, we had, and Denmark, not to speak about Denmark, had huge budget problems, lax fiscal policies, budget deficits back in the 70s and 80s. They're gone because of budgetary discipline. The previous Minister of Finance back in the 90s, later Prime Minister, Mr. Göran Persson, said famously, "He who is indebted is not free." Which is what you can see today in Greece and Southern Europe. And I think the Swedish Prime Minister, Minister of Finance today, Mr. Anders Borg, who is conservative politician, while Mr. Persson was social democratic politician, would absolutely agree. He who is indebted is not free. Therefore, it is important, whether the state is big or small, to have budgetary discipline. You cannot spend more than you earn in the long run.
Klaus, is that principally why, if I have it right, the Scandinavian countries, compared to the rest of us, weathered so well the 2008 financial crisis?
It is one major argument why we did, because we had the buffers. We didn't have to cut down expenditure or tighten our belts in a period of recession, making the whole thing worse. We didn't have to do that. We could actually try to expand our economy somewhat during the downturn. So that helped. So I think the budgetary discipline lesson is extremely important. And if you would send someone from anywhere else to come to Sweden and talk to the Ministry of Finance today, that is by far the most important lesson they would try to hammer into your head.
Absolutely. Yeah. Back to our guests.
And I think that's important to realize that this is not a right-wing, left-wing divisive issue. Because the tradition in Sweden has been that whether you are right-wing or left-wing, budgetary discipline is extremely important.
Well, that's what, what I was trying to allude to earlier when I was talking about my own country, the United States, where I think in some ways we've lost our way a little bit in terms of those old-fashioned but basic virtues of thrift and deferred gratification and savings and so forth. So anyway, we'll let that...
I mean, absolutely. I mean, Klaus is absolutely right. I mean, you look at the US and the UK budget deficit over the financial crisis and subsequently, and then you look at the Nordic experience, and you can't really identify the financial crisis in the Nordic experience.
Right. I think it's still the case that the average American household holds about 13 credit cards and a debt that we are unable to manage. This gentleman here, yes, sir. Well, then yes.
Sorry. No.
You can share. You pick who's first. I can't quite see all the way back, and you'll both have a chance.
Hi, I'm Hefkett Ruthven, a second-year anthropologist at Edinburgh, but I did Scandinavian studies in my first year. As we're talking about Scandinavia and the Nordic model, I thought I'd bring in Iceland, which has a kind of different size, regional relations, relationship to state, economic situation, you know, with privatization and also most famously with debt. But I wondered, with this both historically and in light of its quite unorthodox recent developments, if the speakers could just talk about the relationship of Iceland to all of this.
It's very difficult. I mean, Iceland is a very special case. It's very, very small. It's the size of a mid-sized UK city. And they were totally dependent on fishery. And what happened suddenly after deregulation of the financial sector is that they went totally bananas and started to speculate not only in fish, but in future fishing rights and derivatives on derivatives on derivatives on future fishing rights. And then everything went awry. And now they're sort of coming to their senses again. But it's an experience which is very, very different from the rest of the Nordic countries. So it's hard to bring them into the fold here, to be honest. I hope there's no Icelandic listeners now.
I have 3 more, 4 more, 5 more, 6 more. We'll do our best, but we're almost out of time. You, sir, have been waiting patiently. Are you still game?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's bring this gentleman in the front row, and then we'll go back there. Haven't forgotten him. And then we'll get Jonathan, and we'll close out.
David B. Smith. 2 questions, really. First, what does the Swedish model deliver that the Swiss model does not, while spending 20 percentage points less of GDP? And the second question is attitudes of the state. Britain, of course, had a feudal system which imposed by foreign conquest, where people spoke a different language for 350 years. And it wasn't really till quite late in our history that we had universal suffrage, even male suffrage. And I think people did get to regard the state as predatory. Did Sweden ever have feudalism, or was it rather more like the... Because I think that might be quite a crucial difference in attitudes towards the state.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I mean, that's definitely the case. And in fact, Sweden and Switzerland are the countries that have the strongest sort of type of peasant influence in politics. I mean, with a very well-organized farming class of yeoman peasants, or whatever you want to call them, of free peasantry. And that's a very strong... I think that's a very important aspect of this, that sort of when the notion of Swedish nationalism was created, it was based very much on the idea of these, free farmers. This was the sort of, the lack of feudal organization. And also, I mean, we had I think you can talk about a predatory militaristic state during the 17th century when we had the Baltic Empire, which clearly was waging wars all over the place and drafting the poor people and getting them killed. But even so, historians have shown that there's a remarkable amount of negotiations going on between the local communities and the very centralized state at that point. So even there you have this sort of embryo of this kind of consensus tradition, or sort of some kind of negotiation compromise.
And in Norway and Finland, there was hardly any nobility at all.
No nobility, exactly. But your first question, the answer is that I don't know. I can't sort of really. Switzerland is very different in many ways. I mean, they have sort of direct democracy system. They have a sort of different setup than so it's hard for me to say what it delivers and in comparison to Sweden.
In terms of education, social stability, mobility, and everything else, I would have thought it compared fairly well with Scandinavia. Only at a fraction of the cost. Yeah. That's the point I was making.
Here's what we'll do. I'm mindful of the time. I want to keep everybody on schedule. I have 3 people, the gentleman all the way in the back who's waited patiently, and then Scott, and then Jonathan. I'm going to take all 3 together, and then these 3 gentlemen can pick and choose what they want to answer. So this gentleman first, all the way in the back, if you would identify yourself, please.
My name is Renfeng Zhao. I'm working for a communication company, Queb Governance. Could I have 2 questions? One question is really short.
No, you cannot have 2 questions. Or you can pretend it's
okay,
one and pack in A and B, but 1 question, please.
I think one of the reasons that Nordic model works is because people are willing to pay high tax. In comparison, I think the rest of the world are not willing to do that. Is there a historical reason for that or not? And also the second question is really related to your the 4 different countries' different relationship with Brussels, with European Union. As we see, I'm just wondering whether what's going on in Brussels and also the current EU crisis would have different impacts on countries in keeping your models. And would these 4 countries develop or evolve differently because of their different relationship with Brussels?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if you pass the microphone over to Scott for your 3 questions.
Thank you. I've always been...
Scott, would you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm Scott Young. I've always been amazed that despite the relatively small population of the Scandinavian countries, they've been able to produce some really world-class, extraordinary exporters. Procordia, Astra Pharmaceuticals, Volvo, etc. And I think within the context of the emergence of China, India, Brazil, etc. Klaus mentioned Saab. My first car was a Saab, but unfortunately they've gone the wrong direction. Is the Nordic model sustainable with the overlay of not cheap goods from afar, but very high-quality goods at a lower price?
Okay, we're going to hold that, and then Jonathan finally.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Paris. I'm doing a study right now called The Future of Europe 2030. And Henrik, I asked you this yesterday, so I throw it out to the other two members. One thing's for sure, Jeff's right. There's something good about this Nordic model, and people seem to want to be part of it. So my question is, do you see Estonia as perhaps graduating from a Baltic state to a Nordic state? And perhaps do you see Finland, by converse, perhaps slipping out of the Nordic community?
Let's take Graham first. You pick and choose as to what you want to respond to, and then use this also as your last chance to make final remarks. Graham.
I'm just wondering whether Jeremy Paxman's going to follow your questioning line and say, choose which one response you want to make. Scott, I think I'll take you if you don't. And gentlemen, I apologise if I'm not answering your question. I think part of the answer to your question is actually in some of the global competitive indices and in Legatum's own prosperity index as well, where you see very high scorings there in terms of management ability, in terms of innovation, and in terms of the sort of institutional background you need to facilitate capitalism effectively. So I think I would say that combination of that and shrinkage in the size of the state has delivered and could continue to deliver. But I actually think that in the 21st century global economy, even the current levels of the size of the state are not going to be sustainable given emerging market competition. And so I think in terms of the management and the openness and the freedoms within these economies to facilitate capitalism, I think that's there, it's clear, it's institutionalized, and that will go on. But I don't think they can be complacent in any way either.
Klaus?
The very first question was whether it's possible to keep this high level of taxation, if I understood you correctly. And perhaps. It depends whether the government delivers what it promises and whether people actually want to pay tax. So far, so good, after we came down from the very high levels of the 80s and 90s. But my guess would be yes, if we deliver, or if the government, local government delivers. Can I comment on the issue of globalization and competitiveness? I have really nothing much to add to what you said about the internationally competitive companies, but I think there's been another kind of challenge from globalization to all of our countries, the Nordics as well as the UK, and that is the fact that many jobs, many positions are being movable. They can move. And not only, like previously, the sort of low-educated jobs, but more and more we're going to see those with high education being challenged because their jobs can move away because of new technology as well. And that means that if we want to keep full employment or fuller employment, we also need to see that the non-movables, menial, sometimes low quality or low education jobs, that there is a labor market for those. And that is a problem in the Nordic countries at the moment because of the high thresholds and high immigration. So I think the challenge to the Nordic model is actually to make the labor market, we must be able to walk on two legs. Not only create these high-level, high-technology jobs that everyone's talking about, but also to be able to create a labor market where you can get a job even if you are not highly educated. And I think that is another kind of challenge to the Nordic model and the welfare state, which we're not talking too much about, actually.
Thank you. Henrik, please.
I'd be boring, but I agree with the two gentlemen previous here, because I really think that in Sweden now there's enormous talk about education in solving this problem, meaning globalization with education. I'm all for that. I mean, it's actually great that we're having those discussions, but the problem is that we're not talking about what's going to happen with those 50% who don't get higher education. And I'm just elaborating on what you guys said here, I think, it really is a problem, because this idea of I've argued that there's sort of an egalitarian sort of cultural input here into the Swedish, not model, but way, or whatever you want to call it. And it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, we've seen that since the 80s. I mean, the income gap has increased. The 20th century meant that it was closing up until the 80s, and it's slowly. I mean, in Scandinavia, it's fairly not so much, but it's increasing. and just how are we going to find jobs for these people? How are we going to keep everybody? Because basically, this is a Protestant Lutheran country with a very strong work ethic, and if you don't have a job, then you're actually not really a full citizen. I mean, that's a problem. And how do we maintain that? Because that's the way to citizenship. So I see a huge challenge there. Definitely, I don't think I'm. I don't want to be naive about that. I'm just sort of still think that there's a case to be made for bringing the state in and trying to solve these problems, because I'm not sure the market is going to solve them for us.
Well, that, sadly, Henrik, has to be the last word, A, because it's a fabulous conversation, but B, you're here at the robustly free market Legatum Institute, and you got that last word about bring the state in to solve these things, but you did it. Well, first of all, I want to say a word of thanks to our live audience today. Thank you for joining us. Again, Hal Williams, the historian and scholar and senior counselor to the Legatum Institute, who helped design this program. To you, Madam Ambassador, thank you for being here and your introductory remarks, and your colleagues from the Swedish Embassy. This is for us, I hope, the beginning of a long and fruitful collaboration for Legatum Institute and for our Prosperity Index. If you ever slip, still come back. But we don't think you will, based on what we heard today. And Graham and Koss and Henrik, what a dazzling performance and very collegial, and thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.